This is Dawn Angelique Richard complaint against Sean Combs and everybody. I just got to keep it real. It's a lot of people named on this complaint. I'm going to name some of them: Bad Boy, Sean Combs Music, Interscope, A&M Records, Diego America Supply Inc., doing business as Ciroc Distilling Company, doing business as Ciroc Canning Company, Comb Wines and Spirits LLC, Janice Combs Publishing Inc., Janice Combs Publishing Holdings Inc., Sony Music, Love Records, Epic Records, Doe Corporations 1 through 10, and Doe Defendants 11 through 20. This is the preliminary statement. Dawn Angelique Richard, known professionally as Dawn Richard, is an American musician, singer, songwriter, and performer. She gained widespread recognition as a member of the girl group Danity Kane, formed by defendant Sean Combs, and later transitioned into a key member of Mr. Combs' band, Diddy, Dirty Money. Then it goes on to say who Diddy is. We already know who he is. Then it says, in 1998, Mr. Combs explained the origins of his stage name in a USA Today interview. His nickname was Puff because he had a temper and was known to huff and puff when he was angry. Over the decades following his rise to fame, Mr. Combs' star-studded, larger-than-life persona overshadowed his vicious temper and persuasive acts of violence directed towards those in his inner circle, specifically women. Mr. Combs' namesake temper frequently manifested in physical violence. Mr. Combs regularly hurled objects in fits of rage, often throwing items such as mobile phones, laptops, food, and studio equipment across the room or at people. On numerous occasions, Miss Richard witnessed Mr. Combs brutally beat his girlfriend, Miss Cassie Ventura. His persistent abuse included choking, strangling Miss Ventura, striking her with his hands and with objects, slapping her, punching her, and throwing items at her, including a scalding hot pan. On many occasions, Miss Richard tried to intervene, offering Miss Ventura support and encouragement to leave Mr. Combs. Each time, Mr. Combs learned of her efforts to help Miss Ventura and became enraged, threatening Miss Richard's life with statements such as, "You want to die today? I make niggas go missing, and I end people." Compounding Mr. Combs' violent acts and death threats, he exploited Miss Richard's musical talents as a singer and writer while withholding her rightful earnings, stealing her copyrighted works, and subjecting her to years of inhumane working conditions, which included groping assault and false imprisonment, among other violations. For nearly a decade, Mr. Combs manipulated Miss Richard with mantras that submission to his depraved demands was necessary for career advancement, instilling in her the belief that such abuse and exploitation were required for female artists to succeed in the music industry. It was not until Miss Ventura's bravery in coming forward that Miss Richard realized her own personal suffering was tied to the many years of abuse by Mr. Combs that had become normalized for her. As more women courageously come forward, plaintiff has been empowered by this collective strength and now adds her voice to the growing chorus of victims bravely sharing their harrowing stories. Together, they seek justice and stand in solidarity as the latest victims of the Me Too movement in the music industry. I'm skipping where Dawn names all the parties that's named in this complaint, and I am also skipping the jurisdiction and venue and going straight to the factual allegations. And I will be reading not all of it, but the parts that I think is most important, that I feel is most important. So here we go. The factual allegations. Miss Richard is selected to be in Mr. Combs' all-female musical group, Danity Kane, after competing on MTV's Making the Band. In or around 2004, Miss Richard was selected to participate in season 3 of MTV Network's reality television show, Making the Band. The show centered around the formation and development of a new musical group under the mentorship of Mr. Combs. The contestants would compete and be chosen by Mr. Combs to form a band, which would go on to create albums and perform. Then it goes on to talk about how the band was formed, how many albums they sold. Then Mr. Combs fired bandmate Aubrey O'Day and Juanita D. Combs would get whatever from Dandy King on live television at the height of his fame in 2008, which resulted in Dandy King being disbanded in 2009. Next part. Miss Richard first encounters Mr. Combs' aggressive, intimidating behavior and animus toward women. During the auditions and on the set of Making a Band, Mr. Combs projected an aura of superiority, wealth, and power. Mr. Combs regularly wore sunglasses and avoided looking the female contestants in the eyes, contributing to an atmosphere of uncertainty and intimidation. During auditions, Mr. Combs spoke to the female contestants in a hostile, condescending manner, making disparaging gender-based remarks such as calling them fat, ugly, bitches, and hoes. Miss Richard felt threatened and intimidated by Mr. Combs' blatant disdain for the young women, like herself, who were excited for the opportunity to be on his show. Once the band was made, Mr. Combs' contempt for women was readily apparent as he continued to display aggressive and hostile behavior towards Miss Richard and all her female Dandy Kane bandmates. Mr. Combs regularly referred to the 5 women as bitches and hoes and denigrated their physical appearances. By way of example, Mr. Combs stated that Miss Richard was too skinny and needed to do something with this, meaning her face. On one occasion, in or around 2005, during the first season of Making a Band 3, Miss Richard observed Mr. Combs' ex-partner and the mother of 3 of his children, Kim Porter, leaving Mr. Combs' recording studio in tears with visible facial injuries, including a lacerated lip. Realizing that Mr. Combs was capable of committing acts of violence against women caused Miss Richard to feel deep apprehension and fear that Mr. Combs could one day physically harm her. Miss Richard was present when Mr. Combs was introduced to Cassandra Cassie Ventura for the first time in or around 2006. The moment Mr. Combs first saw Miss Ventura, his demeanor shifted. Mr. Combs positioned himself directly in front of Miss Ventura's seat, invading her personal space and fixated on her with an intense and unyielding stare, isolating her from other people in the room, including Miss Ventura's then boyfriend, music producer, Ryan Leslie. Coincidentally, this first meeting between Mr. Combs and Miss Ventura was the first time Miss Richard was in Mr. Combs' presence without a camera crew filming. Observing Mr. Combs behave in such an intimidating, predatory manner the first time that they were off camera made Miss Richard feel deeply apprehensive and afraid of him. Subsequently, Miss Ventura ended her relationship with Mr. Leslie and began dating Mr. Combs, who would become violent and abusive towards her. Danity Kane's sexual harassment, inhumane treatment, and denial of basic needs by Mr. Combs. Okay, we're getting to another part. For the majority of Miss Richards' tenure as a member of Danity Kane and Diddy Dirty Money, Mr. Combs required her to remain at his various residences and studios in New York, Los Angeles, Florida, and New Jersey for activities such as recording, rehearsing, dress preparing, costumes, and exercising. Throughout the productions of Making a Band 3 and 4, Mr. Combs deprived Miss Richard and her Danity Kane bandmates of basic needs such as adequate food and sleep. When Miss Richard and Danity Kane bandmates requested meals or rest, Mr. Combs refused and chastised them with derogatory comments like, "You bitches don't want this," or "Y'all are not hungry enough," and "I'm paying you bitches to work." This demeaning behavior gradually undermined Miss Richard's confidence and contributed significantly to her growing feelings of insecurity and fear of reprisal from Mr. Combs. Upon information and belief, Mr. Combs would regularly be awake for prolonged periods of time because he was high on drugs. During these periods, Mr. Combs demanded continuous access to Miss Richard and her Danity Kane bandmates, often forcing them to record and rehearse for stretches of 36 to 48 hours without breaks. Forced to choose between eating and sleeping, Miss Richard lost a significant amount of weight, weighing approximately 100 pounds at a height of 5 feet and 4 inches. Miss Richard began to normalize these extreme conditions and perceive them as standard requirements of her participation in Danity Kane. Mr. Combs regularly sent his associates to wake Miss Richard and her Danity Kane bandmates in the overnight hours so he could watch them rehearse. The regulatory of these disturbances led Miss Richard to adapt by sleeping in a sitting position, fully dressed and with makeup on, heightening her anxiety. Over time, this abnormal sleeping arrangement came to feel routine, further normalizing Mr. Combs' invasive demands. In addition to exhausting rehearsals, Mr. Combs required Miss Richard and her bandmates to participate in intense workouts with a personal trainer. On one occasion, while running on the beach, Miss Richard became so dehydrated that she vomited. Instead of offering medical assistance, MTV Network's camera crew filmed the incident, contributing to her acceptance of such treatment as part of her professional life. The unrelenting and rigorous schedule of rehearsal, performance, and near constant filming that Mr. Combs imposed caused Miss Richard to experience extreme weight loss, dehydration, fatigue, and painful rashes from the microphone pack she was required to wear on her back. These conditions intensified Miss Richard's feelings of powerlessness, as she increasingly viewed them as part of her professional reality and feared the consequences of any resistance. In a further assertion of power and dominance, Mr. Combs insisted on holding meetings while dressed only in his underwear. On one occasion in 2008 at his Miami residence, Mr. Combs emailed Miss Richard directly for her to meet him in the living room. When she arrived, he was wearing only his underwear. Miss Richard asked Mr. Combs to put clothes on, but he refused, stating, "This is my fucking house." Mr. Combs then conducted a meeting lasting approximately an hour while dressed in his underwear, causing Miss Richard to feel violated and embarrassed and amplifying her feelings of powerlessness. Following the official Danity Kane breakup in early 2009 by Mr. Combs, Miss Richard experienced significant financial hardship. With no prospective opportunities for employment within the entertainment field, Miss Richard spent several months traveling from Baltimore to Daddy's house recording studio in New York without pay or allocated budget. Mr. Combs promised that Miss Richard's compensation would result in payment of license fees and royalties for her contract with Bad Boy Records. However, no such compensation was ever reported or paid to Miss Richard. Damages related to this continuing copyright infringements will be proved at trial. This section is about Diddy Dirty Money. Miss Richard experiences Mr. Combs' gender-based physical violence, criminal acts, sexual assault, threats, and intimidation. By approximately the fall of 2009, many of Miss Richard's compositions had been recorded by other Bad Boy record artists. Due to the success of her compositions, Miss Richard was invited to meet with musical artist Kalina Harper, and shortly thereafter, Mr. Combs, Miss Richard, and Miss Harper formed a new group, Diddy Dirty Money. Initial recording for Diddy Dirty Money's album, Last Train to Paris, took place in Mr. Combs' home in Los Angeles, California. On the first day of recording, Miss Richard and Miss Harper arrived at Mr. Combs' home and waited in the kitchen, where Mr. Combs' girlfriend, Miss Ventura, was frying eggs for him. Miss Richard observed Mr. Combs come down the stairs looking high on drugs, enter the kitchen, approach Miss Ventura, and scream, "I've been asking you for my shit. I can't stand you, bitch. You never do it right." Mr. Combs pushed Miss Ventura against the wall and choked her, then picked up the scalding hot pan of eggs and threw it at her, causing her to fall to the ground in a fetal position. Cursing and screaming, Mr. Combs dragged Miss Ventura up the stairs. Frozen in shock and terror, Miss Richard heard glass shattering, crashing, and banging noises as Mr. Combs dragged Miss Ventura up the stairs. Miss Richard wanted to intervene, and help Miss Ventura, but Miss Harper adamantly refused to intervene in Mr. Combs' relationship and physically led Miss Richard, out of the residence. Terrified and shaken, Miss Richard returned to her hotel where she was unable to sleep due to worrying about Miss Ventura and her own safety. From here on out, I think I'm going to, instead of saying Miss Richard, because I keep on saying Miss Richard, I'm just going to say Dawn. How about that? Dawn. Now let me continue. The following day, Dawn received a call demanding that she return to Mr. Combs' residence to continue recording. Mr. Combs brought Dawn and Miss Harper to the recording room at his studio, locked the door, dimmed the lights, and gave each of them flowers. Mr. Combs went on a length stating, "This is normal. This was just a lover's argument where no one was hurt. This is what love is. I'm giving you an opportunity. If you want to make it, you'll shut your mouth. If you say anything, there will be consequences." Mr. Combs further warned that people end up missing. Being threatened while locked for over 20 minutes in a small, enclosed space with Mr. Combs, after observing Mr. Combs violently assault Miss Ventura the day before, Miss Richard, Dawn, was terrified and genuinely believed that Mr. Combs would follow through on his threats. In or around November 2009, after the Soul Train Awards in Atlanta, Georgia, Mr. Combs flew Dawn and Miss Harper to his house in New York on his private jet for an after party. There were many well-known celebrities at the after party, and copious amounts of illegal drugs were being openly consumed. Upon information and belief, Mr. Combs had arranged for dozens of young women and girls, some of whom appeared to be underage, to be transported to the party. The women arrived wearing little to no clothing and were giving drugs and alcohol. Many of them appeared to be lethargic or passed out while Mr. Combs and his guests performed sexual acts on them. Miss Richard believed that her presence, Dawn believed that her presence at the party was a test to see whether Mr. Combs could trust her. Mr. Combs repeatedly said things like, "This is a buffet. Enjoy yourself. This is what we do. This is how we party." Miss Richard felt shocked and horrified at the sight of Mr. Combs and his guests violating incapacitated young women and implored Mr. Combs' personal assistant, Capricorn Clark, to allow her to leave. Miss Clark insisted that Miss Richard wait 15 minutes for Miss Clark to make it make sense. That is, to make Miss Richard exit less conspicuous so that Mr. Combs would not notice that she had left. Knowing that she was not free to leave and had to wait for Miss Clark to help her orchestrate her departure, Miss Richard experienced feelings of panic and being trapped against her will. Mr. Combs placed Dawn in similar situations with no means to escape. At Mr. Combs' drug-fueled parties, his guests, including Dawn, were required to surrender their phones upon entry. Mr. Combs kept the doors locked and guarded by security personnel, making it impossible for Dawn to leave without alerting Mr. Combs she had done so. Mr. Combs hired police officers to attend his parties, sending a clear message to guests that his influence extended to law enforcement officers and creating a climate of fear, and warning that reporting him to authorities would be both unacceptable and futile. On many occasions, Mr. Combs had parties in Miami, Florida residence that lasted for several days. At one of the parties, Dawn witnessed Mr. Combs openly stating that he had arranged for busloads of young exotic girls, such as mixed, black and Asian, Indonesian, and albino. Once again, Dawn observed inebriated young girls being sexually violated by Mr. Combs and his guests. In a state of panic and terror, Dawn fled to the bedroom. Mr. Combs had insisted she stay in and barricaded the door shut with furniture. Mr. Combs openly assaulted Miss Ventura in front of Miss Richard and other witnesses on multiple occasions. On one occasion, in or around the fall of 2009, Diddy Dirty Money was in New York preparing to perform at a festival. Inside their vehicle, Mr. Combs grabbed Miss Ventura's neck, pulled her out of the van into the grass, and pinned her head down, choking her while yelling, "You gonna get fucked up today." This incident took place in the backstage area just outside the festival and was entirely visible to passersby. In another instance, in or around early 2010, Mr. Combs punched Miss Ventura in the face in the bathroom of a party in Los Angeles. Frequently, Miss Ventura attempted to voice an opinion or stand up to Mr. Combs. He would strike her or wrap his hands around her throat and choke her. On the first several occasions that they observed Mr. Combs assault Miss Ventura, Miss Richard and Miss Harper spoke with Miss Ventura to support and encourage Miss Ventura in escaping her abusive relationship with Mr. Combs. Every time that Miss Richard and Miss Harper tried to intervene, Mr. Combs learned of the conversation and became irate. Mr. Combs screamed at the women, "Y'all bitches don't get in my relationship. Don't tell my bitch what she need to be doing. Just make money and shut the fuck up. I end artists. I shelve careers you could be missing. And you bitches want to die today?" Among other threats. Here go another part. Interscope Records enabled Mr. Combs' gender-motivated violence. Let's see what this say. In or around late 2009 or early 2010, Bad Boy Entertainment entered an agreement with Interscope A&M Records. Upon information and belief, Bad Boy was paid $50 million in exchange for Bad Boy's future releases being distributed through Interscope. In doing so, Mr. Combs intended to capitalize on Interscope's significant resources and enhance the promotion and sales of Bad Boy releases, including Diddy, Dirty Money's upcoming album. In the weeks and months leading up to Bad Boy Interscope deal, Mr. Combs had frequent meetings with producer and then CEO of Interscope Records, Jimmy Levine. On one such occasion, Combs hosted a dinner at a West Hollywood, California restaurant, which Miss Richard and Miss Harper were required to attend. Among the guests at the dinner were celebrities like Neo and Usher, as well as Mr. Iveen. At the dinner, Mr. Combs and Miss Ventura had an argument. In front of the dinner guests, Mr. Combs hissed at Miss Ventura in a screaming whisper and forcefully punched her in the stomach, causing her to double over in visible pain, crying. Miss Clark escorted Miss Ventura out of the restaurant, and Mr. Combs remained and continued socializing with the dinner guests. At this point, Interscope Records clearly had actual knowledge that Combs was dangerous around females and that Combs was willing to brazenly batter a female in public. Even after Mr. Iveen watched Mr. Combs commit a violent assault in front of numerous profile witnesses, the Bad Boy Interscope deal took place and remained in effect, providing Mr. Combs with immense financial rewards and enabling him to commit further acts of violence without fear of repercussion. Watching Mr. Combs openly assault Miss Ventura in front of Mr. Iveen and various celebrities, and observing that other powerful music industry representatives were complicit in Mr. Combs' behavior, amplify Miss Richards' fear that Mr. Combs could one day harm her and that his actions would be accepted and normalized by everyone surrounding him. As part of the agreement between Bad Boy and Interscope, Interscope heavily promoted Diddy, Dirty Money Last Train to Paris album. Mr. Iveen had presented Mr. Combs with the demo of Coming Home for him to produce, a song that would become a multi-platinum hit. Mr. Iveen was encouraging Mr. Combs to develop a new sound for the album, into which Interscope was investing significant resources. Miss Richard, Miss Harper, and Miss Ventura all provided vocal performances for this project. Released in November 2010, the album Last Train to Paris became Diddy, Dirty Money's most commercially successful project, providing vast financial rewards to both Interscope and Mr. Combs. Here's another part. Diddy, Dirty Money. Mr. Combs subjects Miss Richard to labor trafficking and oppressive working conditions. Okay. In or around the fall of 2009, Diddy, Dirty Money began recording the song Love Comes Down. Upon information and belief, Mr. Combs continued to use drugs that caused him to remain awake for prolonged periods of time. When he was awake, he would demand that Miss Richard and Miss Harper record in the studio. Miss Richard, look, y'all gonna get Miss Richard, Miss Richard, Dawn, whatever. When he was awake, he would demand that Miss Richard and Miss Harper record in the studio, where they would spend 3 to 4 consecutive days recording without a break to eat or sleep. Mr. Combs required Miss Richard and Miss Harper to remain at his home continuously, denying the opportunity to return to their hotel rooms for breaks. The degree of control Mr. Combs exercised over Miss Richard's daily life and basic needs exacerbated the significant power imbalance and threatening atmosphere that ensured Miss Richard's compliance with his demands. Mr. Combs regularly left the studio and required Miss Richard and Miss Harper to stay and write verses to songs. Occasionally, Miss Richard tried to leave to get something to eat or to go to her hotel. Whenever Miss Richard tried to leave, Mr. Combs would call and demand, "Where the fuck are you? And we have an album to make." Mr. Combs frequently made threats, especially if they asked for food or rest, stating, "You're a bitch. I don't want to see your fucking face. I make niggas go missing and I make things go away." Each time, Miss Richard returned to the studio immediately, believing that Mr. Combs was capable of following through with his threats. Mr. Combs criticized Miss Richard for being too skinny, yet denied her request for food and demanded that she drink only peanut butter shakes. Mr. Combs had full meals prepared by a chef and ate them in front of Miss Richard, Miss Richard, and Miss Harper, never offering them food. Miss Richard and Miss Harper begged for food and for rest breaks, but Mr. Combs refused, making statements such as, "Absolutely fucking not, and this is what it takes to be great." Mr. Combs' responses underscored the threat he posed and heightened Miss Richard's concerns for her safety and well-being. As Miss Richard continued to work nonstop, transitioning between the studio, rehearsals, workouts, and back to the studio, she became severely dehydrated and experienced chronic stomach cramping, from which, being undernourished and excessively thin. On the numerous occasions that she told Mr. Combs that she was not feeling well, he called her lazy and dismissed her health concerns, instilling in her future apprehension of communicating her needs. In or around the summer of 2010, Miss Richard experienced abdominal pain, swollen glands, and a fever. She was hospitalized and diagnosed with arthralgia, whatever, joint pain due to overuse sprains, tendinitis and infection, anemia, and a low white blood cell count. Miss Richard presented Mr. Combs with her medical record specifying that she needed to emphasize eating well, being adequately hydrated, and getting adequate rest. But Mr. Combs ordered her to report to the studio the next day for another multi-day recording session. Mr. Combs' blatant disregard for her health and well-being cemented Miss Richard's fear of his authority and control over her career and health. Miss Richard continued to witness Mr. Combs' abuse towards Miss Ventura. Miss Ventura often wore sunglasses and makeup in an attempt to hide visible injuries. These incidents further solidified Miss Richard's fear of Mr. Combs, as they were constant reminders of the physical dangers she potentially could and eventually would face. Mr. Combs often exhibited uncontrollable anger during recording sessions, throwing objects like albums, laptops, and food against the wall or at individuals. Mr. Combs frequently flew into frenzied, unpredictable rages. Miss Richard feared making any misstep that could direct his anger towards her. However, her fears went beyond her immediate physical safety, because she had witnessed Mr. Combs' violent nature, a side of Mr. Combs that the world had not yet seen. She feared that falling out of Mr. Combs' good grace, or worse, standing up to him or speaking out against him, could result in serious harm to her. Miss Richard frequently thought about Mr. Combs' threats about making people go missing and feared taking any action that could label her as a target. Despite Mr. Combs' violent threats and misogyny, Diddy, Dirty Money, experienced significant sales of records, selling 2 million copies of one single, 500,000 of another in the U.S., and in Australia, 5 million single copies. Miss Richard's unpaid wages and royalties are estimated at $1.2 million. Miss Rashad unpaid touring wages are estimated at $350,000 over for touring dates within the United States. This part is Ciroc Diddy Beats non-payment. This is Dawn Richard discussing her non-payment that she didn't receive for the work that she done did. So I'm going to skim over this, but I will be reading some of it. In or around the summer of 2009, Miss Richard and Miss Harper were required by Mr. Combs to perform as part of Diddy Dirty Money and attend numerous promotional events, including late or overnight parties, all of which were under contract between Mr. Combs and Ciroc Vodka, or between Mr. Combs and Diddy Beats, to the Bad Boy Interscope record deal. Miss Rashad was never compensated for the extra time she spent fulfilling Mr. Combs' promotional contracts, including the Ciroc and Diddy Beats campaign, which Mr. Combs was paid approximately $250,000 per Ciroc appearance. Mr. Combs did not compensate Miss Rashad or Miss Harper for their appearances, other than just $5,000 each on a handful of occasions. Mr. Combs' ongoing explanation for withholding compensation was that their appearances were a requirement for their tour. Additionally, Miss Richard was required to appear and to promote Diddy Beats through parties, album songs, and videos. Over time, Mr. Combs was paid $6.25 million for 25 Ciroc shows that Miss Richard was required to attend. Following each show, Miss Richard and Miss Harper approached Mr. Combs to inquire about their insufficient and sporadic payments. Mr. Combs routinely responded with statements such as, "You bitches aren't grateful," and "You don't want this." Miss Richard estimates losses from Ciroc campaign promotions totaling at least $1,562,000. Upon information and belief, Mr. Combs received an advance on Diddy Beats, for which Miss Richard received no compensation. This is Mr. Combs sexually harassed and assaults Miss Richard. I'll be skimming over this, but still reading some of it. Between approximately 2009 and 2011, throughout Diddy Dirty Money's recording process, rehearsals, and performances, Mr. Combs repeatedly ordered Miss Richard to strip down to her underwear. He frequently referred to her as a bitch or whore and made demeaning remarks about her body, alternately calling her lazy, fat, ugly, and skinny, particularly in front of his friends, producers, and bodyguards. Often, while they were recording in the studio, Mr. Combs would hold parties where he would invite young men and women who were scantily dressed and appeared underage to use drugs and engage in sex acts. Miss Richard observed Mr. Combs and his colleagues kissing, groping, and inappropriately touching the young women. Upon information and belief, the participants often left the immediate area to have sex and returned shortly thereafter. On numerous occasions between approximately 2009 and 2011, under the guise of preparing for performances, Mr. Combs would intrude into Miss Richard's changing room at Daddy's house unannounced while Miss Richard was undressed. Even though a female stylist was present and assisting Miss Richard with her wardrobe, Mr. Combs would grope Miss Richard's body, including her bare buttocks and chest and near her breast. With no legitimate purpose and without Miss Richard's consent, Mr. Combs caressed her buttocks to show the stylist where he wanted her high-waisted panties positioned, and attempted to touch her breast, claiming to show the stylist where he wanted her bra straps to go. When Mr. Combs would enter the changing room, Miss Richard would cover her chest with her hands to prevent Mr. Combs from seeing or touching her breast. When Mr. Combs would touch her body, Miss Richard would attempt to swat his hands away and state, "Don't touch me." Mr. Combs frequently smacked Miss Richard's bare buttocks and often commented on her body, noting that although she was too skinny, she had an ass. Ignoring her visible and communicated discomfort, Mr. Combs persisted and continued to intrude when Miss Richard was in the dressing room, continued to touch her buttocks and breast area under the guise of showing the stylist what to do, and continued to smack her buttocks without her consent. In or around October 2010, Diddy Dirty Money performed in Glasgow, Scotland, where Mr. Combs engaged in overt sexual advances towards Miss Richard. On numerous occasions when Miss Richard exited the dressing room fully styled, Mr. Combs looked at her approvingly and smacked her buttocks while making comments such as, "You're looking good. Okay, Don, okay." And, "I see what that is," in a flirtatious tone. Each time Miss Richard moved away and asked him not to touch her, but Mr. Combs disregarded her protest. On their last night in Glassall, Miss Richard witnessed Mr. Combs and several other males gang-banging Mr. Combs' female assistant at the hotel pool. Miss Richard immediately left and went to her hotel room. On the flight back to the United States the next day, Miss Richard asked Mr. Combs where his assistant was. Mr. Combs replied, "I don't give a fuck where that bitch is." Miss Richard later learned that Mr. Combs had taken his assistant's passport with him to the United States, leaving the assistant stranded in the United Kingdom. In Gladsall, Miss Harper confided in Miss Richard that her husband and manager, Tony Vick, Mr. Vick, was abusive. After an especially severe assault, she confided in Miss Richard that she wanted to leave Mr. Vick, and Miss Richard helped her to plan her exit from the relationship. However, Miss Harper and Mr. Vick reconciled, and both Mr. Combs and Mr. Vick, who had a close relationship, learned of Miss Richard's role in helping Miss Harper. Both Mr. Combs and Mr. Vick became noticeably distrustful of Miss Richard, which exacerbated her fears of harm and reprisal. When Mr. Combs would require his Diddy Dirty Money bandmates to stay at his residence in Miami, Miss Richard would barricade herself inside her room at night, placing heavy furniture against the door because she feared being harmed in her sleep. In or around late December 2010, Miss Richard, Miss Harper, and Miss Ventura were at Mr. Combs' Los Angeles home where Mr. Combs stated, "I want to gift you fake titties for Christmas." Mr. Combs rushed out and cupped Miss Richard's breast without her permission and stated, "You're an A. I'm thinking a D." Miss Richard recoiled in shock and left the room. Throughout the above-mentioned time period when Miss Richard resisted Mr. Combs' advances, Mr. Combs retaliated by denying her singing parts in songs, removing her from songs, refusing to allow her to sing in performances, and turning her microphone off during performances. The more Miss Richard rebuffed his advances, the more Mr. Combs' retaliated behavior increased. Mr. Combs assaults and falsely imprisons Miss Richard. Here goes the other part. In or around December 2010, Diddy Dirty Money was preparing for an upcoming performance on Saturday Night Live. An unusual rehearsal lasted 4 days without the opportunity to eat or rest, and the rehearsal schedule was unpredictable. After waiting all day for Mr. Combs to call or send a car, Miss Richard received a phone call from Mr. Combs demanding, "Where the fuck are you bitches? You bitches don't want this. Y'all don't deserve to have someone pick you up. Get a cab." Miss Richard and Miss Harper immediately took a taxi to the studio, anxious because Mr. Combs sounded enraged. Upon their arrival at the studio, Mr. Combs and Harvey Pierre were waiting for them in the lobby. Mr. Combs screamed obscenities, whatever, at them. "Where the fuck are you bitches? You bitches don't want to win. You don't want this. I'm so tired of y'all." Miss Richard noticed that people in the lobby were reacting to Mr. Combs' tirade. Embarrassed, Miss Richard asked Mr. Combs to stop swearing and calling them bitches in front of everyone. Mr. Combs' facial expression shifted as he stepped towards Miss Richard, raised his arm, and swung his fist towards her face. Believing that Mr. Combs was going to hit her, Miss Richard braced for the impact. Before Mr. Combs could strike her, Mr. Combs' bodyguard grabbed her, escorted her out of the studio, and forced her into the Bad Boy Records Bentley that was parked outside. Miss Harper ran after Miss Richard, and Mr. Combs' bodyguard closed and locked the Bentley's doors with both women inside. Inside the vehicle, Miss Richard realized there were no interior door handles and that they were locked inside with no way to escape. Miss Richard's belongings were in the studio, but she was able to call her father from Miss Harper's cell phone. Miss Richard relayed to her father what had happened and that she needed help and feared that she would go missing. Moments later, Mr. Combs' bodyguard removed only Miss Harper from the Bentley, leaving Miss Richard locked in the car alone for 2 hours. Miss Richard screamed as loudly as she could, but no one responded. It was late evening in the wintertime. The windows were heavily tinted and the interior of the car was dark, except for the faint interior lights. Miss Richard's belongings and winter coat were in the studio, while the ignition was off and there was no heat. With Mr. Combs' prior threats and violence running through her mind, Miss Richard felt sheer panic, terror, and feelings of claustrophobia at being locked in a small, dark, enclosed space with no way to communicate or call for help. She began to feel cold and fear for her life, not knowing when or if she would be released. Miss Richard's father drove to New York from Baltimore and arrived at the studio approximately 2 hours later. Only after her father arrived and demanded to see her did Mr. Pierre order Mr. Combs' bodyguard to release Miss Richard from the vehicle. Mr. Pierre ushered Miss Richard's father between several rooms at the studio, where he waited for approximately 2 hours before being able to confront Mr. Combs. Once Miss Richard's father expressed that he intended to contact police, Mr. Combs warned him to think about your family and think about your daughter's career. Her father appeared visibly frightened by Mr. Combs' threat and actions, which in turn made Miss Richard feel terrified for herself and her family's safety. The next night, Diddy Dirty Money performed on Saturday Night Live. Mr. Combs subsequently called Miss Richard, complimented her performance, and concluded with a threat. You don't call your dad unless you're in the hospital. Miss Richard discusses in this complaint about copyright infringement. I'm not going to read that. I'm going to go straight to damages. And it says, as a result of the acts and conduct complained of herein, Miss Richard has suffered and will continue to suffer the loss of income, wages, benefits, royalties, promotional fees, touring fees, and other compensation. Miss Richard also has suffered, among other things, future pecuniary losses, emotional pain, suffering, inconvenience, loss of enjoyment of life, post-traumatic stress disorder, anxiety disorder, insomnia, panic attacks, and other non-pecuniary losses, entitling her to an award of compensatory and punitive damages, injunctive and declaratory relief, attorney fees and costs, and other remedies as this court may deem appropriate.
It can be done, and if I'm going to do it, I'm going to do it at the best of my ability, so that no matter if no one loves it, they cannot say it wasn't of quality. Right. Be ready. So if you want to take the risk, but be ready with the tools to be able to do it. Some people say, I'm going to go do this, but they're not built to sustain what comes with it. Like, if you decide to take a risk, understand you're going to probably be out there on your own. To be ahead means you won't be loved.
I love him till I go, and people won't understand that, but Puff has always been exactly what I thought him to be, and because of it, he's let me go and let me live and let me fly, and I will always be grateful for that. Always know to love myself and believe in myself more than anyone else, because if you do that, the world will believe in you too. And he taught me that, because he will tell you the sky is purple, and you'll be like, it's not. At the end of the day, you'll think it's purple. You'll think it's purple because he's brilliant at because he'll believe it and he'll promote it and he'll make sure that people see the passion in it. And I've learned that from him, and I've put it into my business, and that's why I think it's been so successful.
I would like to know how you all feel about this situation, and while you are letting me know, could you please like and share this video and subscribe to Genevasclosett if you haven't already done so right here on YouTube. And you can follow me on Facebook at Genevasclosett, and you can email me at genevasclosett22@gmail.com. You all have a fabulous day, and I will talk to you later. Bye.